The charting didn't lie. That was Dr. Mercer's first problem with Natalie Hayes. He stood in the dimly lit physician's lounge at Cedar Creek Medical, scrolling through 6 months of her electronic notes on the hospital network, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk. Every entry was meticulous. Every timestamp precise. Every medication documented to the minute, cross-referenced against the surgeon's orders, flagged against the device implant times in post-op records. The kind of charting that didn't just document patient care, it created an audit trail so clean it was practically fluorescent. Which meant she'd caught the discrepancy in his patient files. Patient 847, surgical date March 14th. The Zimmer device implant showed a billing code for the premium model, the one with the titanium alloy reinforcement. $7,200 extra per unit. But his operative note clearly described the standard prosthetic. Same implant. Different code. Different payout from the medical device supplier. $4,200 in kickback money that had been quietly wired to an account in Grand Cayman. Per device. 12 devices that month. And she'd flagged every single one. Mercer had built his kickback arrangement with careful precision over 18 months, just enough extra margin to stay beneath the audit thresholds, coordinated with the supplier's sales rep who'd become very wealthy under this arrangement. But then 6 months ago, she arrived. Natalie Hayes. Floor nurse. Mid-30s. Face like someone had assembled it from spare parts and decided not to bother improving the result. She'd started working nights on his units without any introduction, without any of the typical institutional jockeying for position, without doing anything except showing up and charting with the obsessive precision of someone counting bullets in a war zone. He'd noticed her because she'd gotten in the way. Not physically, she was careful, always to the side, never making demands. But her charting had made her impossible to ignore. The clock on the wall read 11:17 p.m. The night shift was in full operation, the hospital moving through its darkest hours with the kind of quiet momentum that only healthcare workers understood. Mercer closed the laptop and stood, his mind already calculating responses. He could challenge her charting accuracy. Claim she was misreading the operative notes. Suggest she was too new to understand the billing codes. But that was defensive, and defensive meant she'd started asking questions already. Defensive meant she'd written it all down. He needed to know what she knew. And he needed to know it fast. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, the copper scent of old blood that never quite washed out of hospital walls, no matter how many times they scrubbed. His shoes clicked on the tile floor as he made his way toward the medication room where he knew she'd be restocking the evening supplies. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in plastic coffins. Around the corner, he could hear the gentle rattle of 4 bags being organized, the soft clink of glass bottles being arranged by dosage. There. The medication room door was propped open, the light spilling out like a rectangle of false daylight. Natalie Hayes stood with her back to the door, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that suggested she didn't spend much time sitting down. Her blonde hair was pulled back in the kind of utilitarian bun that had no interest in aesthetics. Her badge hung from a lanyard turned backward, he'd noticed that before too. Who turned their hospital badge backward unless they didn't want it visible? Unless they didn't want anyone reading their name? She moved with an economy of motion that Mercer had initially taken for shyness. One hand extended toward the shelf. One hand accepting the medication. No wasted movement. No fidgeting. No the nervous energy that most of the younger nurses carried. It was the movement of someone who'd practiced the same action so many times that her body had memorized it completely. Muscle memory, they called it. The kind of muscle memory that came from repetition so severe it became second nature. The kind of repetition that came from somewhere other than nursing school. Ms. Hayes. He didn't make it a question. He made it a statement, the way you'd announce someone's presence to a room. She turned slowly, deliberately, her dark eyes meeting his with the kind of blank expression that might have fooled someone who didn't know how to read people. Mercer had been reading people his entire career, it was how he'd built his network, how he'd cultivated allies, how he'd identified which doctors would look the other way when the billing codes got creative. He could read people. And what he read in Natalie Hayes was someone who'd already calculated every exit in the room. Someone whose hands were relaxed not because she was calm but because they didn't need to be tense. Someone whose eyes had noted his position in relation to the medication room door, the distance to the hallway, the location of the crash cart that hung 3 rooms down. Dr. Mercer. Her voice was flat. Neutral. The kind of voice you'd use to order coffee. 6 months of working under him, and he'd never heard her raise it above a speaking volume. Never heard her laugh in the break room. Never heard her participate in the small gossip that kept hospital culture lubricated. She was a ghost in scrubs, and her voice matched that assignment perfectly. I noticed your recent charting on the post-op suite. He let that sentence sit there, watching her eyes for a reaction. Nothing. Not a flicker. The kind of composure that made him understand, for just a moment, why people with certain skill sets didn't need to show their hands. They could just let their hands rest on the table and people would fold anyway. Very thorough. Very detailed. It's important to chart accurately, doctor. She turned back to the medication shelf, her fingers continuing their precise work, for bags arranged by dosage, by frequency, by the mathematical logic of hospital systems. Patient safety depends on clear documentation. There it was. That flat statement of fact. Not defensive. Not questioning. Just a simple articulation of principle, delivered with the kind of certainty that didn't invite argument. Mercer felt something shift in his chest, not quite fear, but something adjacent to it. Respect, maybe. For an adversary. Of course it does, he said carefully. Though sometimes documentation can be misinterpreted. Billing codes, for instance. They're quite complex. Easy to make assumptions about what was implanted versus what was billed. She didn't respond. She continued organizing the medications. Her hands were steady. No tremor. No hesitation. Just the kind of mechanical precision that suggested she could organize medications in her sleep and probably had, at some point. Her fingers moved to an 4 bag labeled with a code for cardiac support medications, and she placed it with the others, creating a perfect visual taxonomy of pharmaceutical preparedness. I'd hate for misunderstandings to affect your standing here at Cedar Creek, Mercer continued, his tone shifting into something warmer, more mentor-like. You've done good work. Solid work. The kind of work that gets noticed by the right people. Or the wrong people, depending on perspective. Now she turned to face him fully. Her dark eyes met his again, and for just a moment, he saw something shift behind them, not emotion, but recognition. Like she'd just identified what kind of animal was standing across from her. Like she'd already decided whether to swat it or simply let it pass. Thank you for the feedback, doctor, she said. Is there anything else? The politeness of her refusal was exquisite. She wasn't being dismissive. She was being transparent. She was saying, without saying, that this conversation had ended, that she'd understood his meaning perfectly, and that her response was indifference. Not hostile indifference. Just indifference. The kind that suggested she'd faced much larger predators than a cardiologist with a kickback scheme. Mercer left the medication room feeling like he'd encountered something he couldn't quite quantify. Something that didn't fit the normal hospital hierarchy. He walked back toward the physician's lounge, his mind already working through strategies. He could have her reassigned. He could question her nursing credentials. He could start small, a criticism during rounds, a suggestion that her charting was too detailed, that she was taking on tasks outside her scope. He could make her career at Cedar Creek uncomfortable enough that she'd leave on her own, take her meticulous documentation somewhere else, somewhere far away from his post-op patients and their convenient billing codes. He didn't realize that Natalie Hayes wasn't running from him. She was already positioned exactly where she needed to be. She had been for 6 months. In the medication room. In the hallways. In the silent spaces of Cedar Creek Medical, moving with the kind of purpose that looked like invisibility. The faded 7th Special Forces group patch was sewn into the lining of her jacket, hanging in her locker 2 floors below, folded against her body armor and the other things from a life that the hospital didn't know existed. Room 4C was 3 hallways over. The elderly man in that room had been her assignment for 187 days. Colonel Marcus Webb, retired from 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, was sitting in that room with the kind of dementia that made him a national security risk. Not because he was dangerous, because he was broken. Because his mind was failing and he might say things. Might reveal operations. Might name people who were still in the field. The kind of operational security liability that required someone present 24 hours a day. Someone who could document his mental state, assess what was being lost, and flag what needed to be protected. Army intelligence had placed her here 6 months ago. Captain Natalie Hayes, 3 years in the Hindu Kush, 2 deployments with 7th Special Forces Group, had been reassigned to Cedar Creek Medical under a civilian cover identity that included nursing credentials and 6 months of night shift work designed to make her invisible. She was supposed to be the quiet nurse who nobody noticed. The one who restocked supplies and charted accurately and never, ever mentioned the fact that the old man in room 4C had her call sign tattooed on his weathered forearm in ink that had been applied in a FOB medical tent 20 years ago. She was supposed to remain invisible for as long as the colonel lived. Which was supposed to be weeks, based on the trajectory of his condition. Supposed to be long enough for the facility to confirm his cognitive decline, for Army intelligence to pull her out, for her next assignment to begin. But then Dr. Mercer had noticed her charting. And her charting had told him something he wasn't supposed to know. And now she had a problem that didn't exist in the original mission parameters, an institutional threat that wanted to understand her too well, look at her too closely, figure out what she was doing and why the billing codes mattered so much to someone who was supposed to be just a nurse. That wasn't the worst part, though. The worst part was that she couldn't defend herself without compromising the mission. She couldn't explain that every medication she'd charted had been accurate because she'd been trained in medical protocols by combat medics who understood that precision meant survival. She couldn't reveal that her careful documentation had flagged Mercer's scheme because military intelligence training meant learning to see patterns in data that civilian auditors missed. She couldn't tell him that she was here because a decorated operator in room 4C was deteriorating into someone who might accidentally reveal classified information if his dementia progressed unchecked. She could only watch him leave the medication room, knowing what came next. The social pressure. The questions. The subtle campaign to make her career untenable at Cedar Creek Medical. He would try to isolate her. Try to make her leave. Try to remove the one piece of his operation that didn't fit anymore. And she would have to let him try, because compromising the colonel's security mattered more than protecting her own standing. Natalie finished organizing the medications with hands that remained perfectly steady. The hospital hummed around her, the sound of a ventilator somewhere down the hallway, the electronic beep of a cardiac monitor, the distant voice of a resident calling for a nurse in a tone that suggested someone was about to be very uncomfortable. The sounds of Cedar Creek Medical doing what it always did. Healing. Documenting. Existing in that strange space between life and the possibility of its ending. She pushed the medication cart back toward the supply alcove, her limp barely noticeable in the empty hallway, and thought about the colonel in room 4C. About how he'd looked at her yesterday with the kind of vacant stare that suggested his mind was somewhere else entirely. Maybe in Sanjin Valley, Helm and Province. Maybe in a FOB command center. Maybe just lost in the fog of a neurodegenerative disease that was stealing his memories one day at a time. She would need to increase her documentation on his condition. Flag the changes. Make sure Army intelligence understood the timeline. Because if the colonel was deteriorating faster than expected, that changed things. And if Mercer started pushing her out, she might lose access to the one patient who mattered. She rolled the medication cart into place, the wheels clicking softly against the linoleum floor, and headed back toward the patient rooms. Just a nurse. Just someone invisible. Just someone waiting for whatever came next. The next morning, Dr. Mercer was waiting in room 3B when Natalie finished her med rounds. He stood with his arms crossed, his Italian leather shoes gleaming against the linoleum, and when he saw her approaching with the medication cart, his jaw tightened like a man preparing for war. The patient inside, a 68-year-old recovering from spinal fusion surgery, was propped in the reclined bed with his wife seated in the corner chair and their adult daughter standing near the window, both of them scrolling through their phones in the early morning quiet. Natalie knocked, entered, and that's when Mercer's voice rose like a blade being sharpened against stone. "Nurse Hayes, explain to me why you administered pain medication at 1400 hours instead of 1500 as I explicitly ordered." His words clipped and precise, each one a hammer blow. The wife looked up sharply. The daughter turned from the window. Natalie's eyes moved to the medication record on the clipboard, but Mercer didn't pause. "No, actually, don't explain. I've noticed you have a persistent problem following physician orders. Perhaps nursing school didn't adequately prepare you for the complexities of professional healthcare environments." His voice didn't raise, it didn't need to. The condescension dripped like poison, sweet and unmistakable. The room's air pressure seemed to drop. Natalie opened her mouth and Mercer cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I don't recall asking for your interpretation, Nurse Mouse. Perhaps you should stick to emptying bedpans and let the actual medical decisions to the physicians." Natalie Mouse. The nickname landed in the silence like a punch. Her jaw muscles tightened, visibly, unmistakably, but her hands remained steady at her sides. Her face stayed absolutely stone still, the kind of composure that comes not from weakness but from the knowledge that she could break him like a pencil and had chosen not to. The wife's eyes went wide. The daughter looked away in shared embarrassment. Natalie exhaled once through her nose and spoke, her voice level as a surgical laser, the order stated every 4 hours as needed. "Doctor." The patient requested medication at 13:55. That's 5 minutes early, which falls within standard post-operative pain management protocol. "I don't appreciate the tone, Nurse Hayes." "Yes, doctor." She turned to the patient, her movements precise and professional. "How's your pain level now, Mr. Chen?" "On a scale of 1 to 10. It's better," he said quietly, his wife reaching out to squeeze his hand in silent support. Mercer left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway with the confidence of a man who believed he'd just won. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Natalie had been documenting every single one of his post-surgical device orders with the precision of someone trained to gather intelligence. And those records showed a pattern: orthopedic implants ordered at volumes that didn't match patient needs, vendor invoices routed through shell companies, billing codes that didn't align with actual procedures. $40,000 monthly, moving like smoke into accounts registered to a Delaware corporation. His mistake was assuming that meticulous charting meant someone was just careful. It meant someone was building a case. That afternoon, the break room fell silent the moment Natalie entered. 3 nurses, Jessica, Marcus, and Dr. Patel's resident, sat around the small round table with their lunches, phones, and the kind of careful distance that comes when people sense a problem they don't understand. Natalie opened the refrigerator, pulled out her sandwich in its clear plastic container, and sat down at the far end of the table. Jessica's phone suddenly became urgent. Marcus remembered he had medications to administer. The resident stood abruptly, citing a patient callback. The room emptied in 40 seconds, leaving only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the tick of the wall clock. She chewed mechanically, her expression unchanged, but something in the set of her shoulders spoke to a control so absolute it bordered on inhuman. The kind of control learned in places with names like Kandahar and Kona province, where loose emotion could get people killed. 2 days later, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the hallway where everyone could see it. The paper was printed on the hospital's official letterhead, and the message was written in Mercer's precise handwriting: Nurse N. Hayes, failure to follow physician orders, insubordinate behavior during patient care, inappropriate tone with supervising physician, counseling required, file attached. Her hands didn't shake once as she read it, though the small vein at her temple pulsed with mechanical precision, like a clock counting down to something neither of them understood yet. She looked at the paper for exactly 3 seconds, committing every word, then walked away without expression. The thing about Mercer was that he'd done this before, called out nurses publicly, posted write-ups to intimidate, used his position like a cudgel. It worked on most of them. They cried in supply closets or took the criticisms to heart or started looking for jobs elsewhere. But Natalie wasn't like most of them. The faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, the one she wore under her scrubs on cold mornings, bore the insignia of the 7th Special Forces Group, and she'd spent 3 years in the Hindu Kush mountains learning that humiliation was a weapon only if you let it be. So she didn't cry. She didn't protest. She didn't even speak to her union rep, though she had every right to. Instead, she kept charting. She kept documenting. She kept watching. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, unannounced and impossible to ignore. The 300-pound meth addict kicked through the emergency room doors at Cedar Creek Medical like he was kicking down a wall, his pupils blown to black, his voice a roar that made the waiting room nurse flinch. He was searching for pharmaceutical access, for something to match the chemical fire burning through his veins, and he'd chosen Cedar Creek because it was close to downtown Denver and he'd heard the security was soft. He was right about one thing. He was catastrophically wrong about everything else. Natalie was restocking supplies in Trauma Bay 2, her hands moving with methodical efficiency, rolling the medication cart through its inventory when she heard the doors boom open and the shouting begin. She didn't rush. She didn't freeze. She paused, the supply bottle still in her hand, and listened to the tenor of the chaos the way someone reads a barometer for weather patterns. 2 security officers, both of them barely managing their composure, both of them approaching with de-escalation voices that trembled just slightly. A nursing student, Sarah, 22 years old, pressed back against the triage counter with her ID badge swinging like a metronome. Dr. Mercer appeared in the hallway, took 3 seconds to assess the situation, then turned and walked briskly toward the physician's lounge. The lock clicked. He was gone. The meth addict's attention shifted. His eyes landed on Sarah the way a predator's eyes lock onto movement. He covered the space between them in 3 strides, his hand closing around her throat, her feet leaving the ground, her face going white as all the air in her lungs became suddenly unavailable. The security officers froze. No one moved. No one breathed. "Where's my fucking meds?" His voice was a truck engine revving, all fury and chemicals and the particular madness that comes when the body overrides the mind. Sarah's hands clawed at his arm, her face starting to purple, and that's when Natalie turned from the supply cart. The movement wasn't rushed. It wasn't panicked. She set the medication bottle down on the cart with deliberate precision, and as she did, her entire body language shifted, her shoulders squared, her weight dropped to the balls of her feet, and something ancient woke behind her eyes. The kind of something that had spent 3 years in mountains 10,000 feet high, learning to move through danger the way water moves through a river. "Sir, let her go and we can talk about your pain management." Her voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel through tissue, absolutely calm, carrying an authority that made 2 security guards unconsciously stand straighter. He swung at her. A haymaker born of rage and stimulants, his massive arm telegraphed by the rotation of his shoulders, his fist coming at her face like a sledge. She stepped inside his swing, her hands moving on their own, muscle memory taking over, and in 4 seconds, for seconds, he was face down on the linoleum floor with his arm twisted behind his back and her knee on his spine, her hands positioned exactly where they needed to be, her voice calm as still water. "Security, I need restraints. Now." The security officers moved. Sarah collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. A nurse called code response. And somewhere down the hallway, Dr. Mercer heard the commotion through the physician's lounge door and chose not to open it again. The ER doors burst open at 2:48 a.m. and everything changed in the span of a breath. A man 300 pounds of muscle and methamphetamine exploded through the threshold, his pupils dilated to black saucers, spittle flying from his mouth in ragged arcs. His voice came out as a roar that seemed to rattle the fluorescent lights overhead, a sound like a wounded animal backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. "I need oxy. Now. Give me the fucking oxy or I burn this place down." Security guards stationed near the triage desk stood up. Then they immediately stepped backward. Smart. They'd learned in the last 6 months that de-escalation worked maybe 70% of the time, and 30% of the time you were getting thrown through a wall. This man had the look of the 30%, dilated pupils, clenched jaw, the kind of wired energy that comes from 3 days of no sleep and chemical rage burning through his bloodstream like wildfire. The intercom crackled. Someone radioed for additional security. Another voice called for hospital police. Standard protocol. Textbook response. And then Dr. Mercer, who'd been reviewing charts at the physician's station, simply stood up and walked away. Not toward the commotion. Away. He moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood risk-reward calculations, and his calculation was clear: this situation was not his problem. His $40,000 a month kickback scheme didn't need complications. His carefully cultivated relationships with medical device suppliers didn't benefit from hero moments. He locked himself in the physician's lounge, a room insulated with soundproofing and the kind of professional detachment that comes from a lifetime of prioritizing self-preservation. The attacker didn't care about Mercer's exit. He was searching for something else, someone with access, someone in scrubs, someone between him and the controlled substances locked behind the pharmacy gates. He spotted Sarah Chen, the nursing student on her 3rd month of clinical rotation, restocking supplies in Trauma Bay 2. Sarah's hands were full of gauze packets and for starter kits. Her eyes were wide. She was exactly what he was looking for: young, small, accessible. He moved toward her with the lumbering speed of a man whose weight didn't slow down his intentions. His hand shot out and wrapped around her throat. Not a squeeze yet. A threat. A promise. His fingers were calloused and strong, and when he lifted her slightly off the ground, the gauze packets fell to the floor like snow. Sarah's mouth opened but no sound came out. Fear does that sometimes: locks the vocal cords, paralyzes the diaphragm, turns even the sharpest scream into silence. That was the moment Natalie stepped out of Trauma Bay 2, her arms full of prepackaged surgical supplies. She'd been in the back, pulling additional stock, doing the invisible work that no one noticed and everyone depended on. The fluorescent lights caught her eyes for just a fraction of a second, a color like winter ice, a brightness that didn't belong in a face so calm. The attacker swung at her. A wild haymaker, all muscle and no precision, the kind of punch that works great if your opponent freezes and works terribly if they understand basic physics. Natalie saw it telegraphed 3 moves ahead: the shift of his weight to his back foot, the rotation of his hip, the elevation of his shoulder. Muscle memory is the fastest neural pathway the human body possesses. It doesn't ask questions. It doesn't hesitate. She sidestepped. Not dramatically. Not with a flourish. She simply wasn't there anymore. Her hands came up and caught his wrist, the one attached to the arm he'd used to grab Sarah, and she redirected that momentum like a judo master reading water. His own velocity became his liability. His own weight became the problem. For seconds. That's all it took. A wrist lock into a shoulder rotation, a controlled descent onto the linoleum, her knee on his spine in the exact position that prevents movement without causing permanent injury. The man's cheek pressed flat against the floor. His arm was bent at an angle that made further resistance impossible. Her voice cut through the silence like a scalpel, crisp, authoritative, the voice of someone who'd given orders in languages that didn't use words, just commands. Restraints. Now. No please. No apologies. No softness. Just a statement of fact delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that makes people move without thinking. A nurse in the hallway heard it and sprinted for the lockdown closet where the soft restraint straps were kept. Another nurse was already calling hospital police with updated coordinates. Sarah was breathing again, one hand at her throat, her eyes locked on Natalie with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed something impossible. Natalie didn't move. She didn't acknowledge the stares. She didn't release her grip until the restraints were in place and the police officer was turning the man onto his side, securing his wrists, checking his vital signs out of habit more than concern. 40 minutes of paperwork. Statements taken. The man transported to county holding with a mental health evaluation pending. Standard procedure. The kind of thing that happens in Denver on Tuesday nights when the methamphetamine supply is high and the psychiatric beds are full. Dr. Mercer emerged from the physician's lounge at exactly 20 minutes after the initial impact. He'd waited long enough for the danger to pass, short enough that it wouldn't look like he'd been hiding. He surveyed the scene with the careful expression of a man assessing damage, nodded sympathetically to the staff, and walked calmly to his office on the second floor. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to Dr. Patricia Chen, a board member whose son had gotten a DUI 8 months ago and whose case file Mercer had seen quietly closed without charges. 1 phone call. That's all it takes when you have leverage. The second was to Gerald Foster, another board member who'd received for all expenses paid golf trips to Pebble Beach in the last 18 months, funded through a consulting agreement with Mercer's device supplier that required no actual consulting. $8,000 per trip. Foster picked up on the second ring. The third was to Sandra Kim, head of human resources, who owed her entire position to Mercer's recommendation 3 years ago when she'd been passed over by 2 other candidates. She answered with her usual deference. Within 36 hours, an emergency meeting had been scheduled. Not a routine review. An emergency. The kind that suggests something serious happened. The conference room on the administrative floor was cold, too much air conditioning, the kind of artificial cold that makes you shiver, and Natalie sat across the table from Mercer and his carefully cultivated allies. Patricia Chen sat to his right. Gerald Foster sat to his left. Sandra Kim sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, her expression professionally neutral. Mercer spoke first. He had a gift for narrative construction, the ability to take facts and reshape them into stories that served his interests. He'd been doing it for 15 years. It worked. Captain Hayes displayed unstable behavior in Trauma Bay 2, he began, using her rank without knowing he'd just revealed something critical. Unauthorized physical intervention. Beyond the scope of practice for nursing staff. Potential liability exposure for Cedar Creek Medical. The board is concerned about patient safety and institutional risk. He had documents. Incident reports. Witness statements that he'd carefully worded with his allies before the meeting. He had video footage, he controlled the security system, after all, and he'd already deleted the portion showing his own cowardice and her precise, professional response. All that remained was her hand on the attacker's wrist, her knee on his spine, and the implication of something dangerous. Natalie sat in silence. The room hummed with the sound of fluorescent lights overhead, a sound like electricity trapped in glass, a sound that never quite stops if you listen long enough. She understood her options with the clarity of someone who'd been trained to think 3 steps ahead of every encounter. She couldn't defend herself with the truth. The truth was that she'd been placed at Cedar Creek Medical by Army intelligence, that her mission was to monitor the retired operative in Room 4C, that his name was redacted from every official record and his presence at this hospital was classified at the level of Special Access Program. Blowing her cover meant mission failure. It meant the old man, the one with her call sign tattooed on his weathered forearm, would be transferred to a facility she couldn't access, somewhere she couldn't watch him, couldn't keep him safe, couldn't prevent him from becoming a counterintelligence liability when his dementia accelerated and his operational memories started leaking out in front of the wrong people. So she said nothing. She'd been trained in silence. Silence was a weapon more precise than any words she could choose. The board voted 3-2 to terminate her employment, effective immediately. Dr. Chen abstained. Gerald Foster voted for termination. Sandra Kim cast the deciding vote. Mercer smiled. The kind of smile that a man wears when a problem solves itself, when the universe aligns according to his plan, when consequences remain theoretical instead of real. Natalie stood up from the conference table without being dismissed. She walked out of the room. No one tried to stop her. No one said goodbye. She was already becoming a memory, a footnote, a nursing student who'd made an unauthorized decision and paid the price for overstepping. By next week, the narrative would be solidified. By next month, her presence at Cedar Creek would be something people barely remembered. She didn't go home. Instead, she found herself in the hospital's laundry facility at 2:33 a.m., folding her scrubs for the last time. The industrial detergent burned her throat and the fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song, and her hands moved with the same precision she'd used every day for 6 months, precise, methodical, complete. Each edge of the scrub shirt was creased exactly in half. Each pant leg was folded with corners meeting perfectly. It was the same ritual she'd performed in a military quarters in Kandahar, folding her uniform before deployment, her hands moving through the motions that preceded everything else. The smell of bleach and starch hung in the air like a ghost. The washer clicked off mid-cycle. Somewhere in the hospital, monitors beeped and people lived and died and the world continued turning while Natalie Hayes, Captain, 7th Special Forces Group, stood alone with a stack of scrubs that she would never wear again. Dr. Mercer emerged from the physician's lounge at exactly 4:24 p.m., 20 minutes after the police had cleared the emergency department, his white coat pristine, his hands unmarked by any of the chaos that had just unfolded on his watch. He moved through the corridors with the deliberate pace of a man whose mind was already 3 moves ahead, already strategizing, already weaponizing. The nurses parted around him like water around a stone. He didn't acknowledge them. He had calls to make. By 6:15 p.m., 3 board members sat in the Cedar Creek Medical Administrative Conference Room on the 7th floor, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. Richard Bancroft, the board chair who'd received 3 generous consulting contracts worth $180,000 annually thanks to Mercer's recommendations. Linda Chen, the compliance officer whose daughter attended the private school where Mercer sat on the admissions committee. And Marcus Holloway, the CFO whose medical malpractice insurance premiums Mercer had personally helped negotiate at rates that saved the hospital $340,000 a year. They owed him. They all owed him something. The room smelled like the expensive coffee nobody actually wanted and the particular staleness of fluorescent air recycled too many times. Mercer didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table like a surgeon about to present a case, and in a sense, he was. He pulled up security footage on the tablet. The moment of the attack, the meth addicts lunged toward the nursing student, and then Natalie, moving with a precision that looked less like medical training and more like something else entirely. Something that raised questions. What you're seeing, Mercer began, his voice steady and measured, is an employee who has escalated beyond her scope of practice. Unauthorized physical intervention. Unstable behavior under pressure. He let the silence settle. I'm concerned about liability. I'm concerned about what this suggests about her mental state. Richard Bancroft leaned back in his leather chair. She stopped an active threat, Paul. The staff is calling her a hero. The staff, Mercer said with a thin smile, doesn't understand the liability implications. Or the fact that she may have acted out of rage rather than clinical judgment. I've been documenting her concerning behaviors for months. He tapped the tablet. The medication timing incident. Her refusal to maintain professional boundaries. And now this, violence, even if well-intentioned, suggests an employee who's become unstable. Potentially dangerous to other staff. Linda Chen's jaw tightened. She'd heard the rumors about what really happened with that medication timing. But she said nothing. The insurance rates were too good. I'm recommending immediate termination, Mercer continued. Before she becomes a liability we can't manage. Before her next concerning incident occurs on our watch. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to the register of confidential counsel. Gentlemen, Ms. Chen, we protect this hospital by making hard decisions. We protect our people. And we protect ourselves. The vote took 8 minutes. 3-0. Natalie didn't fight it. When the termination notice was delivered at the end of her shift, she read it in the break room while other nurses pretended not to watch, and she folded it once, precisely, then placed it in her locker with the same deliberate care she'd once used to secure classified documents. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw ached, but her hands didn't shake. 2 hours later, the hospital laundry facility hummed in the basement of Cedar Creek Medical, the industrial washers and dryers running their eternal cycles, the smell of detergent so thick it coated her throat like chemical snow. The fluorescent lights here were older, yellowed from years of bleach vapor, casting everything in a sickly amber that made the white scrubs look almost grimy by comparison. Natalie folded the last pair. Blue scrubs, size medium, the one she'd worn for 6 months of invisibility, of controlled breath, of swallowed words. She'd changed out of them in the locker room upstairs, but she'd brought them down here, brought them all down here, the entire stack, and she was folding them now with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual. Top fold. Then the shoulders. Then the sleeves tucked in. Then the whole thing halved lengthwise, then folded in thirds. The movements were automatic, muscle memory reaching back past 6 months to other rooms, other countries, other uniforms that had meant something different then. She was folding them the way she'd folded her flag before the helicopter touched down in the Hindu Kush. The way soldiers fold flags. With respect for the mission, even when the mission was ending. The industrial detergent burned her throat like shame. It shouldn't have burned. She'd been disciplined enough to suppress shame 5 years ago, trained it out of herself in places where shame got you killed. But the smell, that particular combination of sodium bicarbonate and surfactants, it bypassed every wall she'd built and went straight to the part of her chest that was still human. The cotton was still warm from the dryer. She folded the top, creasing it sharp enough to cut. She folded the pants. She placed each folded set in a clear plastic bag, and then she placed her name tag in there too, the one that read N. Hayes, RN, the one that had been a shield and a prison all at the same time. The final indignity. The confirmation of what had already been decided in a room she wasn't allowed to enter. Her jaw ached from clenching, had ached for the past 2 hours, since the moment Linda Chen had delivered the paperwork with an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. The facility had done nothing wrong, according to the letter. But her services were no longer required. The decision was effective immediately. Security would escort her from the premises if she didn't comply. That's when the code silver announcement crackled through the overhead speakers with its particular urgency, not the flat panic of a code blue, but the sharp alert that meant someone was being threatened, someone was dangerous, someone needed to be contained. Natalie's hand stilled on the last pair of scrubs. She should have stayed. She was fired. Not her problem. Not her responsibility. The mission was over anyway. Captain Natalie Hayes, 7th Special Forces Group, had been compromised the moment she'd moved. The moment she'd let the old man see her face during the attack, let something click in his deteriorating mind. By tomorrow morning, the Army intelligence directive that had placed her at Cedar Creek Medical would be obsolete, and whoever had been running her operation would be making calls about extraction and damage control. But the announcement came again, code silver, 4th floor, room for C. All available security, 4th floor, room for C. Room for C. The elderly man with the tattoo on his weathered forearm. The retired operative whose dementia was supposed to be isolated, controlled, managed. Whose movement to a civilian facility would mean the loss of the only person in his institutional environment who knew what he'd actually done in the world, who he actually was. A facility where there would be nobody watching, nobody protecting him from the information still locked in his failing brain. She dropped the scrubs. The bag with her name tag fell to the floor of the laundry facility, and Natalie Hayes, no longer officially an employee of Cedar Creek Medical, left it there and took the stairs 3 at a time, the way she'd been trained to move when every second mattered. The stairwell echoed her footfalls. 4th floor. The corridor was chaos, nurses calling out, security mobilizing, someone shouting about a second intruder. The badge on her old ID wouldn't work anymore. She knew that. She tried it anyway on the 4th floor door, and it beeped red, rejecting her, and she was already gone, pushing through an adjacent set of double doors, moving through the break room and emerging directly onto the patient corridor. Room for C was 20 yards away. A 280-pound man with a shaved head and track marks down both arms had the elderly patient by the shoulders, shaking him, screaming something about drugs, about his partner, about answers. The old man's eyes were wide with genuine terror, his mouth working soundlessly, making the shapes of words that his fractured brain could no longer quite assemble. Natalie assessed the scene in the time it took to move 5 feet. The attacker's weight distribution was poor, his grip loose because he was panicking. The elderly patient's heart rate was probably spiking. She could see the panic in his face, the way his breath came shallow. The call button was inches from his other hand, but he was too terrified to reach for it. She was fired. She had no authority. She had no badge and no uniform and no legal right to be here. The attacker saw her and smiled, confused by the presence of someone not running from him, not backing away. "What are you?" That's when the old man's eyes found hers. His gaze cut through the terror, through the confusion, through 6 months of deterioration and medication and the fog of dementia that had been swallowing him in increments. His mouth shaped itself around a single word, cracked and dusty and more real than anything he'd said in weeks. Nomad. The room went absolutely silent. Her call sign. Her actual call sign, from the unit, from the desert, from a life that was supposed to have stayed locked in the lining of her jacket, in the space between her ribs where she kept her secrets and her scars. The attacker didn't understand. He started to turn back toward the old man, and that's when Natalie moved, not the careful motions of a nurse, but the fluid, economical movements of someone who had trained this response 10,000 times. She crossed the 5 feet between them in a stride, took the man's wrist in a compliance grip that made him scream, and drove him downward and forward, his momentum carrying him face first toward the linoleum. She landed on top of him, her knee positioning itself on his spine with the weight distribution of someone who'd done this to men 3 times his size in situations where hesitation meant death. The scream died in his throat. His arm went rigid beneath her grip. "Don't move," she said quietly. "Breathe through your nose. Comply and I won't break anything." He complied. The Marine volunteer at the 4th-floor visitor desk, a 60-year-old named Tom Reese with a Vietnam service cap hanging on his locker, had heard the code silver and gone cold the way old soldiers do, recognizing the particular timbre of chaos that meant direct confrontation. He'd looked up just as Natalie had moved past his desk, and then just as she'd emerged from room 4C with the attacker subdued. He saw her face. He knew that face the way old soldiers know other soldiers. There's a particular way the world sits on your shoulders after you've carried a weapon in a place where it meant something. Tom Reese pulled out his phone and accessed the military database, the one the hospital gave to the veteran volunteers, the one with limited access but enough information to verify service records. His hands were shaking as he typed. "Captain Natalie Hayes," he called out, his voice cracking. Staff members had begun gathering in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. United States Army. Dr. Mercer was already pushing into the room, his face purple with the particular rage of a man who'd seen his narrative being rewritten in real time. "Security. This woman is trespassing. She's been terminated. I want her arrested immediately." Tom kept reading from his phone, his voice getting steadier with each sentence, with each confirmation that he wasn't imagining it. 7th Special Forces Group, 3 combat deployments to the Hindu Kush. Silver Star recipient for Valor under fire. Mercer tried to interrupt. "That's..." Citation reads, Tom continued, his voice now carrying the weight of someone reading scripture, "for carrying a wounded operative under enemy fire across 4 miles of mountainous terrain while performing emergency needle decompression for tension pneumothorax following indirect fire trauma." The old man in the bed was crying now, his weathered hand reaching toward Natalie, his fingers trembling. A 2-star general visiting his colleague in the adjacent cardiac wing appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion, the voices, the particular cadence of military recognition happening in his hospital. He assessed the scene in one long look, the subdued threat on the floor, the young woman with the controlled posture, the nurse in the doorway still reading from his phone with the reverence of a man who understood what he was actually witnessing. The general pulled out his phone, made a call, and his voice when he spoke was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Captain Hayes." The general's voice carried the weight of command, each word precise as a scalpel. "Captain Hayes, I'm General Patterson, Deputy Commander, Army Intelligence Operations. We need to talk about your status." He moved into the room with the fluid economy of movement that came from 4 decades of wearing stars, and the air pressure in room 4C seemed to shift. The elderly man in the bed, the one whose name Natalie had never spoken aloud in 6 months, looked between them with eyes suddenly sharp, suddenly present. The dementia fog that had clouded his afternoon seemed to lift like morning mist burning away. He knew. He had always known. The dealer still had one meaty hand on the old man's shoulder, but the calculus had changed. A two-star general in dress blues with 7 ribbons on his chest was not part of any scenario a street-level methamphetamine addict had trained for. The man's pupils dilated as the math happened in his drug-addled brain: run, or stay and watch everything collapse. He ran. The hallway doors banged open and closed. Nobody followed him. Nobody needed to. But that wasn't the revelation that stopped time in that room. Tom Rees still stood in the doorway, phone trembling in his hands because he had figured it out in the 37 seconds between hearing Nomad and watching this general appear. The Marine volunteer, a veteran himself, corporal in the 5th Marines, someone who understood what certain call signs meant, had accessed the hospital's public employee database on his phone the moment the old man whispered that single word. He started reading before anyone could stop him. His voice shook. Captain Natalie Hayes, Silver Star recipient, for carrying a wounded operative under fire across 12 kilometers of hostile terrain in Helmand Province, maintaining tactical position while helicopter support was delayed due to weather. His eyes met hers. 2 purple hearts. Bronze Star with Combat V. You didn't just disarm that first attacker. You carried someone out of hell. The old man's arm lifted slowly, his tattooed forearm catching the afternoon light that slanted through the window. The faded ink was still readable: Nomad. Her call sign. Her name in his skin. He'd been carrying her all along, even as his mind dissolved, even as the dementia tried to erase everything. Some memories went deeper than neurons and synapses. Some memories lived in the bones. General Patterson's salute was crisp, the kind of salute you gave to someone who'd carried your nation's secrets and its soldiers through the worst terrain on Earth. Captain, your status with Army intelligence is being reviewed as we speak. You were placed here under operational orders. The situation has evolved. He spoke like someone accustomed to being understood with minimum words. The patient you've been protecting has value to national security. His location needed to be kept classified. Your behavior has now classified you as a potential asset as well. Questions? She didn't answer. Not immediately. The protocol was to wait. The military ran on silence first, words second. The sound of footsteps in the hallway pulled everyone's attention. Dr. Mercer pushed through the doorway, his face twisted with the kind of desperation that came from watching your narrative collapse in real time. General, I'm not sure what's happening here, but this nurse was terminated for cause this morning and has no authority to be in this hospital. I have documentation of unstable behavior and his words turned to air when the general turned to look at him. Not raised his voice. Didn't gesture. Just turned and looked. The general's eyes held the flat clarity of someone who'd made decisions that sent people into places they didn't come back from. Mercer stopped talking. Dr. Mercer? A woman's voice came from behind him. FBI credentials. 2 of them, both with the worn competence of field agents who'd done this dance before. We need you to come downtown for questioning regarding billing anomalies identified in your surgical department. Your cooperation would be appreciated. Mercer's face went pale. His mouth opened. No words came. The arrest wasn't happening, not yet, but the trajectory was obvious. These weren't hospital administrators. These were federal agents. This was a different kind of authority entirely. What he didn't know, what nobody in that room knew except for Chris Rodriguez, the IT specialist who'd been sitting in the basement server room for the past 17 hours, was that the entire foundation of his power had already crumbled. 3 weeks earlier, Rodriguez had noticed something during routine security maintenance, Dr. Mercer accessing the surveillance system at 2:08 a.m. on the night after Natalie subdued the first attacker in the ER. Not unusual. But then Rodriguez watched the footage gaps. Specific camera angles. Specific times. The security system was designed to log every access, every deletion, every movement through the database. Rodriguez, who'd done 2 tours as a signals intelligence analyst with the Navy, who understood systems the way other people understood language, had noticed the pattern immediately. Someone was trying to erase evidence. Someone was trying to make sure nobody had video of what really happened during that code blue. Someone was trying to silence the only footage of his own cowardice. Chris had pulled everything. Every frame Mercer deleted. Every trace of him accessing the billing system to adjust device orders, to create phantom surgical procedures that generated kickback payments. Every timestamp. Every email to the device supplier CEO. Every wire transfer. He'd saved it all to an encrypted external drive, then copied it to a secure cloud server that even Mercer's access codes couldn't touch. Then he'd done something quietly. Something professional. Something that a Navy veteran understood to be the right thing to do. He'd sent it all to the Colorado Medical Board and the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Division. The investigation had been running for 10 days. Quietly. Methodically. Building case files with the patience of people who understood that corruption in medical facilities wasn't a mistake, it was a crime that cost lives. Device kickback schemes changed surgical decisions. Doctors chose implants based on profit margins, not patient outcomes. People died because someone's commission rate was higher. The investigation had dug deeper. The device supplier rolled immediately, providing emails and wire transfer documentation going back for years. The medical board's forensic accountant traced $847,000 in payments disguised as consulting fees. The FBI agent standing in front of Mercer now held a folder thick with evidence compiled by someone who understood servers better than Mercer understood scalpels. "We can do this downtown, Dr. Mercer, or we can do this here," the FBI agent said quietly. "Your choice. But we are doing this." Mercer looked toward the general, then toward Tom Reese, then toward the old man in the bed whose eyes had cleared completely now, whose presence had shifted from patient to witness. He looked at Natalie, and something cracked in his expression. She was standing straight, her composure absolute, her hands steady at her sides. She was standing like someone who'd been trained to stand while the world fell apart around her. She was standing like a soldier, like a captain, like someone who'd never once flinched when he tried to break her. "I'm calling my lawyer," Mercer said. "Already done," the FBI agent replied. "Your attorney is waiting for you downtown. After you. Both of you." The second agent gestured toward the hallway. It wasn't a suggestion. The uniform in their stance made it a command. Within 4 hours, Dr. Mercer's medical license was suspended pending investigation. Within 48 hours, the Colorado Medical Board had issued a formal notice of revocation proceedings. Within 72 hours, every board member who'd supported Mercer's narrative suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. Dr. Chen stopped returning his calls. Gerald Foster sent a single email, "Cannot be involved." Sandra Kim from Human Resources received a subpoena for every document Mercer had ever touched, every email, every personnel decision. The institutional protections evaporated like morning dew. The walls closed in not with violence, but with bureaucracy. With the slow, inexorable pressure of evidence. With the voice of Chris Rodriguez, Navy veteran, signals intelligence analyst, person who understood that watching someone delete surveillance footage and do nothing about it made you complicit. General Patterson turned to Natalie before he left that room. "Captain Hayes, your service record speaks for itself. Army intelligence wants to discuss your options. There's a call scheduled for 1800 hours. You'll be briefed on details then." He didn't salute her again. Didn't need to. The understanding was complete. Then he turned to the old man. "Sergeant Martinez, your family is being notified of your location. Your daughter is flying in tomorrow. We'll have security in place." Sergeant Martinez. So that was his name. The man whose call sign she carried and whose name she'd carried silently for 6 months while his mind fragmented. He nodded, his eyes still clear, still present, still holding hers with the weight of someone who remembered what it meant to stand beside a person in the dark. The FBI agents escorted Dr. Mercer out of Cedar Creek Medical. His parking pass didn't matter anymore. His credentials didn't matter. His carefully cultivated relationships with board members who'd suddenly gone silent didn't matter. What mattered was the evidence. What mattered was the truth. What mattered was that someone had been paying attention. Tom Reese walked over to Natalie in the hallway outside room 4C, his marine posture rigid with respect. "Captain Hayes, He stopped, trying to find words. "I wanted to say thank you for your service." She met his eyes. "Marine. 5th Marines, Corporal, 2 Tours Kandahar." His voice carried the quiet clarity of someone who understood sacrifice. "Then we're family, Corporal. And you're welcome." She said it simply. No elaboration. Just the truth between two people who'd served. Chris Rodriguez emerged from the stairwell then, still in his IT specialist polo, looking entirely unremarkable except for the way his eyes tracked everything, processed everything. He walked straight to Natalie. "Captain, I saved the security footage. All of it. Sent it to the proper channels 2 days ago." He spoke like someone reporting a completed mission. "You did the right thing, Chris." "Former Navy," he said. "Signals intelligence. 2 tours, Baghdad and Jalabad. I know what corruption looks like. I know what silencing evidence looks like. I wasn't going to watch that happen." He nodded once, the gesture of someone delivering a message and completing their task. Then he returned to the basement server room, where the digital evidence of Mercer's downfall would remain, documented and undeniable. Natalie stood in that hallway at Cedar Creek Medical in Denver, the hospital where she'd spent 6 months being invisible, being underestimated, being judged as just a nurse by someone who'd never bothered to look deeper. The general was already making calls from his secure phone. The FBI was already compiling charges. The medical board was already reviewing evidence that would revoke Mercer's license permanently. The device supplier's CEO was already preparing to testify. The walls weren't just closing in on one man. The entire structure of his corruption was collapsing under the weight of truth. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If you're watching this and you've ever been silenced by someone in power, ever been underestimated because of a uniform or a role, please like this video and subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to know that integrity matters, that someone is always watching, and that the truth has a way of surfacing when enough people refuse to stay quiet. Let me know in the comments, have you ever seen corruption exposed from within?